My name is Alex Howard. For nearly 20 years, I've been a therapist here in London. I am deeply passionate about helping people make real, positive change in their lives. Having been through therapy myself at different stages of my own life, I know how transformative it can be. That's why I started In Therapy, a series that follows the stories of brave participants as they go on therapeutic journeys with me. Join us as we go behind the scenes as people grapple with issues like depression, anxiety, and chronic illness, and join my mission to break the stigma around mental health and asking for help. This is In Therapy with me, Alex Howard.
This is probably about my fourth attempt at this. I tried over the weekend and just I was not in a good place. And you know, no one really needs to see my ugly, snotty cry face. So yeah, I didn't go with that one. I tried to record one of these last night, and it ended up a sort of 20-minute rambling rant. Based on the Wheel of Life exercise you gave me to do. And yeah, there's just no way that was going to be cut down into a 2-minute snappy temperature check. So here goes. I've been in a bad way. I've been having a lot of problems over the last couple of weeks, fortnight really. And I haven't really slept much because I've been having a lot of pain in my leg. But yeah, the best way of describing it is in Catholicism, we like a sort of demented reclusive mystic. So and one of my favourites was always St. John of the Cross, who's the guy who wrote about, the long dark night of the soul. So I think what I would say is I've probably just had about, at least 10 or 14 of those in a row, and I'm really looking forward to the dawn.
David, good to see you.
Hiya.
Thank you for coming back. It's always a promising sign. How have you been doing since last time?
Not well. I've had a real sort of bad couple of weeks. Things in general, just life in general, and sort of work stresses, and wasn't sleeping, and just in the last 2 weeks, I've just felt really, really fucking guilty about my dad dying. It's been something that's been just playing in my head constantly, because, my dad was sort of diagnosed basically the day after lockdown, or the day of lockdown, with terminal cancer. We knew he had cancer and stuff, but we didn't know it was terminal, and that there was nothing that they could do. And at that time, I was actually on the COVID response team for the ministry I work for, and I was like, I'll just come up. And he was like, no, I don't want you to come up, and it's going to be a long time, and it's a long haul, and I don't want to, And also, he was quite emotional at the time, and he didn't want me to see him that way.
Right.
There was different people saying to me, you should just go, and so my ex was one of the people who was saying, just go, you'll regret it if you don't go. And I was like, well, there's these restrictions, and I've got work, and I've got this, and I've got that, and even my line manager was sort of saying, as soon as you can, just go we'll cover for you, we'll do whatever we need to do. There was a point where I could have went, but at that time he was quite well, and so there was this voice in the back of my head saying, just go now, don't wait. And I just was like, no, this is going to be fine. This is what we've planned to do. This is the plan. And then on the Thursday night, which was the night before I was coming up, he got taken into hospital and didn't come out. So I arrived in Scotland on the Saturday morning and couldn't see him because the restrictions on visiting in the hospital and stuff. And so I got to wave at him once through the window on the Sunday in the middle of a rainstorm, with a mask on. And even the rest of that week it was like, oh, he's going to get out, he's going to be fine. And that was what the doctors were telling us. And then he just died, and sort of died alone, surrounded by strangers. And just in the last couple of weeks, all I've been thinking about is, you should have went. And every time I stop thinking about it, I think about it again. Yeah. You should have went. You could have went. You could have seen him. You could have done this. And it's that sort of.
It strikes me that there's a place, I think, where there is a natural sense of regret and wishing that the circumstance had been different, but also wishing that you'd made a different choice in the circumstance. But what I'm also really hearing is that what I would call a sort of inner critic voice that's sort of judging you, attacking you, beating yourself up for the choice that you made, which hindsight's always a wonderful thing. But you made the wrong choice for the right reasons, if that makes sense. Like, you didn't deliberately make the wrong choice. You made the choice because it seemed like the sensible right thing to do at the time.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there's a lot of sort of self-judgment and sort of attacking, criticizing, and beating yourself up. Is that how it feels?
Yeah, I mean, rationally, yeah. It's like, I can think to myself, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't think about that. And like, it doesn't really stop me thinking that way. So,
but it sounds like a lot of your mental and emotional energy sort of goes into dealing with the consequence of that voice of judgment and attack. Does that make sense? That there's a sort of rationalizing against it, or thinking, well, if I'd done that, I could have done, like kind of going around in circles in terms of your thinking, which is a sort of way of trying to manage the sort of onslaught of sort of criticism that's there.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, I have a sort of a phrase that I use a lot, and a sort of strong emphasis on the idea that if you can see it, you don't have to be it. If we can see the structures of how our mind is working, how our emotions are working, that gives us a level of insight and choice to be able to make different choices. And sometimes we need practical tools and strategies to be able to change those things. It's like, we wire our mind and our nervous system up over, decades quite often, sort of to think and function a certain way. And then we take ourselves to be that way because that's sort of how we've always done it. And some of how we are is just sort of innately who we are in our, whether you want to call it your authentic self, your essence, your soul, whatever it's called. But there's sort of that, but then there's the aspects of ourselves which are conditioned and are trained through the experiences we have, the meanings we make, the habits that we create from that. And the sort of this idea of neuroplasticity, that when we wire our brain, neurons that wire together, fire together, wire together. When we have the same thoughts and the same habits and the same patterns, after a while, that's just who we take ourselves to be, because that's how we've always taught ourselves to think, in a sense. And one of the things that I'm often looking for is what are the common patterns or themes within someone's sort of inner world, in a sense. And if we can better understand those, that's often helpful, because sometimes just seeing something allows us to go, do I actually want to keep doing that, or actually do something different? But if that alone isn't enough, it then gives us the clarity to then be able to use potentially various techniques or tools to then try and train our mind or our emotions to function differently in a sense. I'm sort of curious as to, in the context of the circumstance around your father dying, what over these last few weeks where it's been sort of replaying in your mind, what have been the things that you've been saying to yourself? Like, what have been those sort of comments or phrases or statements towards yourself of kind of, self-judgment or self-criticism?
It's just that idea that I should have went, that it's nothing as sort of mental as, things would have worked out differently. But it's just that I would have been able to not even necessarily say goodbye to him, because the circumstances of that wouldn't have changed. I still wouldn't have been allowed into the hospital.
Yeah, sure.
But
and he still would have died.
Yeah.
As you say, it wouldn't have changed the outcome.
And it was just that, I didn't see him. He didn't see me, and I don't think we would have particularly, shared any big revelations. It's not like I think, that I particularly missed out on something, groundbreaking or earth-shattering or something really important. I think it's the fact that I missed out on just the unimportant stuff, that I missed out on seeing him, that I missed out on just spending some time with him. So that keeps going around my head, and it just is like, it's just a feeling that I was really, really selfish. That,
Okay, so there's a judgment that you were selfish.
Yeah.
And part of that is a judgment that you should have done more, like you should have practically done more, and a judgment of you should have been there or you should have made more effort in some way.
Yeah.
And yet there's then in defense from that, there's the sort of also the rational place of, well, you had a job, there was a pandemic, that you couldn't have done much anyway, you don't live there, like other than the fact, like, so that there's a very clear and reasonable response to that. So it sounds like what's happening is that inner critic voice is judging you and attacking you. You're then trying to rationalize and make sense of it, and you're sort of in this dance where you're attacking yourself and then you're trying to defend and rationalize and you're attacking. And it sounds like there's a lot of energy that's sort of going around in that cycle. Is that true, do you think?
Yeah, definitely a lot of that I think probably rings true.
Yeah.
I've always been quite tough on myself, and I think there was an element, as I say, when I got ill, that, part of me became more confident, part of me became less confident, and the part of me that became less confident, is the part of me that's, sort of interested in relationships and stuff. But also I think there was a part of me that was like, I felt like I had to sort of do more, because there is still a sort of stigma around disability and illness. I remember when I first had the strokes, everything had happened while I was on holiday. My parents had taken me away on holiday. It was like between the second and third year of film school. And I remember my sister had taken my mother out for lunch, and I waited for them to sort of ask my father, what all this meant, and I was like, because it's like, well, he's your father, he's not going to lie to you, and he's also a medical professional, he's a physiotherapist, it's like he's going to know
what this means.
Yeah. But I remember getting him alone and sort of saying, well, what does this mean? And he got really, really sort of serious and sort of stood there going, and sort of sighing for ages, and I'm thinking, fuck, I'm fucked. In fact, I might have said that because one of the things that happens when you have a stroke, you kind of just lose sort of. My parents did notice I swore a lot more.
You lose the filter.
Yeah, so it was like, so I was like, yeah, I'm fucked here, and then finally just went, you're never going to play for Scotland. So that, I think, that's a good illustration of that kind of sense of humour.
Yeah, it's funny and it's also very painful.
Yeah, I don't think the things that necessarily I say to myself are that funny.
That sort of humour or at times it can be banter, around amongst friends or in a sort of kind of social situation. That on one hand, on the surface, there can actually genuinely be a sort of it's almost like, I love you enough to make jokes about you, like that. And I think that can be sincere.
Yeah.
But there's also a place where it does also hurt, and it does also land on us in a way which is painful. And in that experience with your dad, it's like he was also, it sounds like, hiding behind humor. It's sort of like,
oh yeah,
it was sort of his way of dealing with his own discomfort, in a sense, in the situation.
Yeah, but I mean, I found out years later, and my father was never one to really, he was always quite an emotional guy. He was never one really to sort of hide his emotions. In this situation, he sort of hid his emotions from me, so he made the joke, and but like I found out years later, my sister told me, yeah, he was going home every night and crying himself to sleep. And that was quite a shocking thing for me.
Yeah.
He always thought he was a great sort of joker. And sometimes he was funny and sometimes he just wasn't. And he couldn't hold his drink. He liked a drink, but like he would have like a glass of wine with dinner, or 2 glasses of wine with dinner, and then have like 2 whiskies and literally be paralytic. So he would fall asleep, and we would just do stuff to him. like me and my mother painted his toenails one day, and he was still working at that time in football, and we got some nail polish and painted his toenails bright red, and he didn't notice. And it wasn't until he had been training with the football, and there's that whole sort of slightly homoerotic camaraderie thing where they all shower together, and he walks out of the showers and he's and I think at that time he was probably, at that time he'd be in his 50s, and he's with these guys who are like sort of in their 20s and like they're all terrified to see him because he's got these bright red nails. And eventually I think one of them said something and he was like, what are you talking about? And because he just hadn't looked at his feet. So things like that would happen.
Going back to this sort of inner critic voice, it sounds to me like it has some different masks that it wears, in a sense. There's sort of the mask of the sort of jokey, sort of sarcastic, cynical, kind of dark humoured sort of mask. Then it sounds like there's the mask of reason, like it's being very reasonable, like you should have done this and you should have done that, and how. So there's sort of that way that it plays out. It sounds like there's another way it plays out, which is just sort of blatant harshness and cruelness and sort of. Did that make sense? And there are other examples that you can. I'm just sort of trying to put a bit more of a spotlight on the sort of tones or styles that it sort of manifests with.
I'll say things, like now, I'll say things that are self-deprecating or sarcastic or, which I think are funny. And I don't really see that as being part of this inner critic or inner voice that we're talking about. I don't.
You can have a sort of dark and sort of sarcastic level of humour, which doesn't have to make you or others feel bad. Like, when you make a joke to me, I don't feel judged or criticised.
Yeah.
I don't feel it's cruel or unkind. I sort of enjoy it as a sort of banter between us. I think that is different to speaking to yourself in such a way that actually it chips away at your sense of joy and your sense of kind of feeling goodness.
Yeah. I think that, you're saying mask or face or whatever like that. That's one that I wear in public. That's one that I meet the world with, for want of a better pretentious term. I think when I'm talking to myself, I don't use that voice. I use the other two. I do recognise the other two. I recognise the sort of rational one, and I recognise the the harsh one.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's probably more the harsh one than anything else that I use myself, on myself.
Yeah. In a way that, of course, you'd never speak to someone else like that we all reserve our cruelest, most unkind thoughts to ourselves generally.
Yeah, I rarely use it on anyone else.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I never have.
No, I understand, but it's not the primary direction of it. And that's my sense. And, you know, my sense from the time we've spent together so far and sort of what you shared in your sort of some of your internal dialogue in the homework is you're someone that is naturally a kind, good person towards others. Doesn't mean you're perfect, doesn't mean you don't screw up and make mistakes, but your general intention is one of goodness in a sense. But it sounds like that you have normalized to a significant level of unkindness towards yourself.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
When one sees it, it's like there's a sort of truth, like, yes, that's true, that's my experience. And there's also, I think it's quite a vulnerable thing to sort of just have one's inner experience taken out and put out there and go, that's happening. It's like, you know, it's quite a sensitive thing in a sense.
You know, sitting here talking now, you know, I can see it and I can sort of rationalise that and sort of say, well, yeah, that's, you know, it's different that sort of
11 o'clock at night when you've had a couple of whiskies.
Well, I was actually going to say 3 o'clock in the morning. That shows the difference in our lifestyles.
I got 3 kids. But yeah, there's a difference between seeing it in the sort of cold light of day in a sort of supported sort of environment and seeing it when you're sort of in the pit in a sense in terms of your own sort of thinking.
Yeah.
But you see that part of our job together is to build enough understanding and clarity that you are then more able to see it in those situations. And also there tends to be a cumulative effect to these things. So we beat up on ourselves throughout the day, and then it gets to the evening and there's no distraction because we're not working and we're not doing other stuff, and we keep beating up on ourselves, and then you have, you know, a bunch of whiskies and then you end up in a certain place.
Yeah.
If we can break that sequence earlier, you're less likely to as frequently go to those places, let's say.
Yeah.
To feel depressed, to feel crap about ourselves, to sort of feel undeserving or not able to sort of do things. There's lots of ingredients that influence that. And, you know, part of that is the circumstances. You know, I think from in totally objective point of view, you've had a really hard year, you know, beyond the struggles of work and the losing of your dad and losing your friends that you've had a hard year. So I'm not sat here saying, David, we just need to sort your thinking out and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Like, there's a reality to the things that have happened, and it's how do we navigate those things in the way which is the most self-caring and the most skillful. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be impacts, and, you know, to have lost your dad and to not be having times where you feel grief and sadness and cry, that would concern me more, quite honestly.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there's a sort of compounding of the suffering that you're experiencing, which is the ways that you've learned to speak to yourself and to relate to yourself. And if we can build more awareness and then in time have some strategies and tools to change some of that, it doesn't mean that everything else miraculously transforms, but it does mean that life can become potentially easier. And then just like people have kind of vicious circles where, you know, you feel shit about yourself, you make poor choices in terms of, you know, drinking too much, whatever, and then you feel more flat and depleted in the day, and then so there's a sort of circle kind of downwards in thinking. We also get these virtuous circles where we kind of move up in a sense, where we make some shifts in how we think, we make some better choices, some better circumstances happen, we feel better about ourselves. And it's not about having some kind of miracle tool or one moment of perfect insight and everything changes. It's about how do we hedge the odds in your favor where we move things in a direction which feels more positive and feels more supportive. So I think the sort of piece of homework that I'd like to sort of to set between now and next time is to do some work about building more awareness around this inner critic. The awareness alone won't change and transform it. And sometimes it's almost, the more we put a spotlight on it, the inner critic judges, we start judging ourselves for judging ourselves, if that makes sense. It's like we see the judgments and then the inner critic comes in and goes, oh my God, you really are completely this, and this. So try and be careful to not let your inner critic use the awareness as ammunition to sort of attack more.
Yeah.
But you can sort of do it as what I call a thought diary, which you can do at the end of ideally each day. It could be every few days. It's often helpful to get in a habit of doing it each day, of what were the ways that you were attacking and judging yourself that day. And you might do it in real time in that moment. It might be you're doing it, sometime in the evening, and in that moment, the inner critic's in action. Or it might be looking back on certain circumstances during the day. But we want to get a sense of both some of the content of the attacks, like the actual things you're judging yourself for, but also the sort of style of the attack. So that sort of, I was pointing out that sort of humorous style, that's that sort of very peering, very rational, sensible style, and that sort of blatant attacking style. But the more awareness and understanding that we can get, that then helps. Sometimes just the awareness alone can get a bit of distance, but also then we can get a bit more practical in terms of sort of tools and strategies to work with that. Does that make sense? Does that sound okay as a piece of homework?
Yeah, it sort of feels true. It feels like the way I treat myself.
Yeah. Don't have to, but if it feels helpful to send me the sort of day before or whatever, a bit of a summary, and I can obviously read that through and it's helpful for me.
Yeah.
We can also go through it together in the session as well.
Cool.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. I hope you found this week's episode of In Therapy helpful. This theme around the inner critic is so important. It's not just that the inner critic causes us misery and suffering on a daily basis. It's also a real block to change, because when we feel criticized and judged, we defend, we shut down, we're not open to change in the way that we ideally need to be. If you'd like to do the homework along with David, please do head over to my Instagram. We put up each day different posts and support to hopefully help you along, but on the days of the episode, so today, we've got specific instructions to help you follow along with the homework. If you've got questions from today's episodes, please do post them below this video. We just last week launched my brand new podcast, Talking Therapy. It's a video podcast here on YouTube. It's also an audio podcast across the various podcasting platforms. In Talking Therapy, I go deeper into some of the themes here on In Therapy, but also answer your questions. It allows us, hopefully, to have a closer connection and to hopefully bring you along for the therapeutic journey with the participants in the series. So please do post your questions below this video and we'll go through those and we'll answer some of those in the podcast. Next week, we're going to be meeting Katie. Katie is going through some quite big and challenging changes in her life. And we're going to be opening up and exploring some themes around her relationship with herself. It's often one of the most challenging relationships in our life, but it's also one of the most important. Here's a taste of what's coming up next week.
I have lived with acute anxiety and depression all my life.
Do you feel that you're being kind towards yourself? Do you feel you're being cruel towards yourself?
I hate myself. I don't think I really know who I am.
That's a really interesting point though, because you hate yourself, but you don't know who you are. So how do you know who to hate?